Thank you, John. And you asking me to say a word of welcome gives me an opportunity to say how proud we are at St. Peter's Church that John Norvell is a member of our congregation. And we're very proud and thankful, John, for your service and your great distinguished achievements. And we're also very grateful at St. Peter's Church for all that Bonnie and John bring here. They are gracious and generous and hospitable and encourage everybody. So I had to get that in. You gave me the microphone. St. Peter's Community Arts Academy was founded in 2005, and our mission was and is arts for all. We provide arts education that would not otherwise be available in our community. We provide instruction in dance, piano, music, violin, cello. I think that's about covers that, guitar. None of which is taught in the public school district. So we're providing that which would not otherwise be available. And typically, across the country, private music lessons are very expensive and therefore can be exclusive. But the mission of St. Peter's Community Arts Academy is arts for all, which means that no student is left out because of any reason, including ability to pay. So we have a board that works very hard to raise funds for financial aid and scholarship, as well as great community support for our scholarship endeavors. And the book signing today, John has decided would support the Arts Academy, and particularly the teen choir, is they're about to embark on a tour, which they take every 3 years, and they're going to be a week-long tour in February, about 35 teenage choristers here. So thank you for being a part of it, and thank you, John.
Welcome. Okay, well, today's going to be sort of like show and tell day. Like I'm going to brought some things in. I'm going to talk a little bit about the F-4 as an aircraft for those of you who don't know anything about it. But first I want to ask, how many people are veterans in the group today? Well, thank you for your service. I know it sounds trite to say that, but I do really, truly mean that. It's important to recognize those who did their duty. And I did my duty for 23 years, and this is what I wore for 6 of those years, almost every day. This is a typical flight suit that you'd wear. You'll notice there are a lot of pockets in it that you can stash your stuff, your hat and maps and whatever else you want to put in there. We always wore a name tag, except when we went into combat and we took the name tag off. And you'll notice that this flight suit does not have rank on it, because if you go into combat, you don't wear rank. So you have nothing to identify your rank or your name that could be used against you if you're taken prisoner. Now, this is the bird I flew for 6 years. The only reason I didn't stay in the F-4 longer was I went to teach at the Air Force Academy. When the Air Force Academy wants someone, the Air Force Academy gets someone. You don't have a choice in the matter. And so I flew in the F-4 from 1972 to 1978. I did not go back to the F-4 because by the time I left the Air Force Academy, I was on the promotion list for Lieutenant Colonel. And there are not a lot of jobs for Lieutenant Colonel backseaters. The navigator sits back here in fighters. The guys that run the fighter squadrons are 99% pilots. Very few other people get to run fighter squadrons. And so I went back to Mather Air Force Base, which is the navigator training base, and I had a job which was the equivalent of a squadron commander there for 3 years that I was there. The F-4 went into service in 1958. Its last flight was in December of 2016. So I had a long record of service to the country. At the time, it was the hottest fighter in the Air Force when I was flying in it. You'll notice it's not a particularly pretty bird, although we flew it loved the bird. It has kind of a nose that droops down here. It has a kind of an odd tail assembly in the back with the 2 wings going down. The wing tips tip up a little bit, but that all added to its aerodynamics. In the back, there is a tail hook that you can kind of see in this model. That's because it was a dual fighter. It also was used by the Navy. Many a time, people have to use the hook to stop the bird on different occasions. This bird has a typical bomb load that you would have seen in Southeast Asia. Those are Mark 82 500-pound bombs. It also has warning radar and RAW, which is radar warning and homing device, and a jamming pod, plus also heat-seeking missiles in the back. We also carried radar missiles on the planes I flew on, so we had a full load for combat missions. If you're interested in some statistics, which I have a cheat sheet for, it was 38 feet long, it was 38 feet wide, 58 feet long, it was 16 feet high at the tail, it could go to 56,000 feet. The highest I ever flew was 53,000 feet. The speed could go twice the speed of sound in the E model, which was the older, the newest, one of the newer models, and it weighed in at about 55,000 pounds with a full load of gas. So it was quite a big airplane. Had a crew of 2. The front seater was called the aircraft commander. He was a pilot. The back seater was a gib, the guy in the back. That's an original name, isn't it? I was a gib for 6 years. When the plane went into service, there were 2 pilots in it. There was a front seater pilot and there was a rear seater gib pilot. The gib pilots were not happy being in the back seat. They didn't like being not in control of the airplane. And sometime around 1968, there was basically a rebellion in the Air Force with the gib pilots who said that they didn't like that. And they opened the back seat up for navigators, which was fine with us because we wanted to be in the back seat. This is one of the only things I ever did in the Air Force where it didn't seem like work. It was fun all the time. I graduated from Hobart in 1966. 50 years ago this month, I started navigator training. Now, if you're good at math, which I wasn't as a Hobart student because I was a historian, you'll quickly figure out that's a 5-year period between when I graduated and when I went into nav school. So what was I doing during that period? Well, 2 years I went to Syracuse and got a master's degree. And then I got out of Syracuse and I had trouble with my vision. It had gone from being able to be qualified to be a pilot to not being qualified to be either a pilot or a navigator. I couldn't pass the flight physical. So what was the Air Force to do with me? Well, I told this story earlier, but I'm going to repeat it here, and I might even use my same visual aid. Let me read it a little bit to you. The Air Force decided to make me a security police officer. And I got an assignment to report on active duty in February of 1968. I reported to the 1100 Security Police Squadron at Bolling Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. to be one of its officers. Would my vis aide please come up here? Thank you. This is my lovely assistant, Max. Could we have a large round of applause for Max? Thank you, Max. I didn't know at the time that this was the Air Force Honor Guard unit. These are the people, the elite units that perform ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery, the White House, and the Pentagon. I walked in the door and the captain in charge took one look at me. I could tell I was not what he expected. To be clear, Honor Guard officers have to be a minimum of 6 feet tall, well-built, and not wear glasses. Well, Max, you couldn't be an Honor Guard officer.
I only need them for reading.
Okay. Unfortunately, I'm only 5'5". I wore glasses, and as I say later on in the book, I'm built like a fire plug, and nothing has changed in all these years. Thank you, Max. When I walked in, he did a double take. In today's world, this would have been like the Imperial Stormtroopers commander in Star Wars, expecting a new officer and in rolls R2-D2. The captain quickly got on the phone, hustled me off to the base personnel office. Somewhere in the bowels of the Air Force personnel system, someone had a strange sense of humor to assign me there. By noon, I found myself in the plans office, working in a command post in charge of base training. I did that job for the next almost 4 years. It was a dead-end job that would lead to nothing in the Air Force as far as promotions or staying in. And I decided I had to get out of that and I had to get into flying, which is what I always wanted to do. And so I tried every way I could possibly do it to get into flying. And really nothing much changed until the situation in Southeast Asia got so bad. The Air Force was burning through air crews at a tremendous rate over North Vietnam and in the war, that they changed the vision requirements to let semi-blind navigators fly. So in November 1971, I drove across country and went to Mather Air Force Base, which was the navigator training base, and I started the NAV program. That was an 8-month training opportunity. We flew in World War II era 2-engine training aircraft called a T-29. It was based on a Convair civilian aircraft in the pre-war period. They used it from 1950 to 1976 when they changed over to jet trainers, which were converted 737s, and they're still using them as far as I know. Some terms you probably want to be familiar with. I got to get my little sheet here so I don't leave any out as I read something to you. An IN is an instructor navigator. An AC is an aircraft commander. I already told you I was a GIB. I was also called a WISO, which is a weapons systems officer. And I think that's about all you need to know. So I'm going to read to you about my first flight in the F-4. I was in training for about 2 months before I got my first actual flight. And so here we are. Then it was time to kick the tires and light the fires. 14 October 1972. Our bird F-4C 662 taxied out of its parking place and moved slowly into position. While Hollywood has accustomed Americans to think that there's considerable banter between aircrew members, that's usually not the case. There's usually strict radio discipline. In the back seat, I finished my checklist as the AC got permission to take off. I often think back to my first flights in the T-29 military trainer. Flying was a mystery to me. The nav trainers at Mather had not prepared me for all of the sensory experiences of flight. The turbulence, the aircraft's motion through the air, the closeness of the cabin, and most of all, the stress that all of this produced. By the time I graduated, I was a seasoned navigator and better prepared. That's not that I knew what was going to come, how it would be to fly in the Phantom. In many ways, the first flight in a jet fighter is like your first sex. You can see it on a movie screen, you can observe it, but you cannot know what it's like until you do it. If this sounds cliched, it's not. I was not nervous, I just did my job. That said, nothing prepared me for the emotional experience that was to come. Now on the runway, the AC instructor pilot pushed the throttles of the jet into military power, passed the detent into the afterburner, and released the brakes. The Phantom jumped off the runway. In the back, it felt like being strapped to a shell and shot out of a cannon. I called off 70 knots. At that speed, the rudder, which is this section of the tail, became effective, and the AC could ease off the nose gear steering, which he basically operated with the rudder pedals on the floor. Then we rapidly lifted off, all by the book, at least in my mind. While the T-29 had cruised at 180 knots, the F-4 broke ground at that speed and routinely cruised at 350 to 450 knots. A knot is a nautical mile. It's slightly different from miles per hour. Things happened so fast, I was playing catch-up right from the start. It was not as bad as my first nav trainers at Mather, but I could see I had a lot to master. Then our wingman joined on us, and I thought, that is a really big aircraft coming fast and close to me. The rejoin to the formation where our wingtip was only 3 feet from his was an eye-opener, for sure. Nothing like that ever happened at Mather in the T-29. Now I had to be aware of the immediate air environment. I became the extra pair of eyes in the back seat. I had to scan the wingman to make sure nothing was out of the ordinary, which was a bit hard to tell for the first time. Over many missions to come, this would become old hat. However, like so many things on that first flight, it showed me that I had entered a new world. The best was still to come. As we approached our training area, things finally began to settle down. Once there, we did some maneuvering. The IP demonstrated turns and climbs. The wingman stayed close, tucked in the formation. I was impressed that he was able to match his lead so well. My only exposure to this type of flying had been in the movies of World War II dogfights, and there was never a wingman tucked tight in them. The G-suit filled and grabbed my legs. Another new thing. I was wearing the F4. Strapped tight to the seat, she moved to port and I went with her. She climbed and dove, and there I was, wheeling and turning over the Arizona desert. We moved through the air. The thought came to me that this was the best roller coaster I'd ever been on. Here was the true freedom of flight. I knew now why I'd worked so hard to get to flight training. Here was the dancing on silver wings of high flight that our ROTC instructor, Major Ted Shorak, had read to us, the promise that Shorak had made. The flight was a far cry from the last 9 months in nav school. The T-29 had been necessary drudgery as we sat at a table learning traditional nav procedures, working for 4 hours without a break. Now, don't get me wrong, any day flying at Mather was a million times better than sitting behind a desk in Washington, D.C., where I'd been a staff officer. I never regretted the decision to fly, but flying in Mather T-29 was not even close to the Phantom. The best thing was that the back seat of the Phantom had no drone work, and that was the bonus of being able to see outside. The absolute joy of flight in a fighter now came to me. I could understand for the first time the enthusiasm of our instructor pilots. They loved the bird and all she could do. I think back, the child's poem comes to my mind. How does it feel to go up in the air so blue? It felt great. It was fun. Flying was fun. My eyes opened to a whole new world above the earth. Now I learned how the radar operated on real targets. All the time and work in the simulator clicked into place. I was beginning to feel good. My confidence level rose. I could see myself doing this and doing it well. Okay, I was a bit cocky and perhaps euphoric, I admit it. I was having a good time. It was good. Really good to be a Gib. It was really, really good to be in a Phantom above the Arizona desert. Then we went to an extended formation. The instructor told me, "You've got the stick." And I shook the stick saying, "I've got the stick." I tried to sound confident, but to be honest, it had never dawned on me I would be flying the bird on the first flight. Here I was, a kid from upstate New York, with my hands on the stick of a top-level fighter. It's hard to put into words my feelings at that moment, now many years later. It was a mixture of pride, awe, excitement, an extreme adrenaline rush that lasted way into the evening, as my wife can still attest. In the years to come, I had the stick on almost every mission in the Phantom. I needed to fly the Phantom from the back seat in case there was an emergency where the AC was incapacitated. And I took that opportunity to fly whenever I got the chance. So that's my first flight in the Phantom. So you're probably wondering about this little ribbon I've got on. There's a little pin. This is the pin I got for my first flight. And this is a pin I got for flying Mach 2. It says F4 Phantom Mach 2 Club. Now, we didn't routinely fly Mach 2. You had to be part of a specialized crew in order to fly that fast. By the time I got to the point where I was flying Mach 2, I'd been flying the Phantom for 6 years. They had crews called FCF crews. FCF crews meant functional check flight crews. What we did was, when a plane had been broken for some reason, we took it up to make sure it had been repaired, so it was flying properly. And generally a profile for an FCF crew would be above 50,000 feet, putting a lot of stress on the airframe to make sure that nothing went wrong. And the last part of the profile would be flying over Mach 2. And at that altitude, you would feel the gas mask ballooning against your face because you had to have the oxygen pushed into your lungs. Your body wasn't able to bring it in itself. It needed what they called positive power pressure breathing to push it into the lungs. In the distance, you couldn't really see space, but you could begin to see a slight curvature to the earth, and there was a slight difference in the coloration of the sky. So that's probably the closest I ever came to being in space. And then the aircraft commander would put the plane into afterburner, tip the nose down, and have the Phantom go faster than Mach 2 as you went down. And the highest I think we ever got was 2.3. So that's my Mach 2 story. Any questions about flying Mach 2 at this point? I'll turn it over to David, who's going to tell you how to build an F4 in your backyard. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm sorry, David. I'll do this first. I have some combat movies. Excuse me, I forgot all about them. I got talking. No signal. Here we go. Sounds good to me. Okay, this is flying over Cambodia. You'll hear some radio call in the background. This is a dawn flight over Cambodia. We're on our way back after an early mission. Our wingman had some sort of a fuel problem, so you'll see his bombs. He wasn't able to drop them, so we had to recover. I took these from the back seat on various occasions, maybe 20 or 30 seconds at a time or a couple minutes, and then spliced it all together later on to get a movie that I took home. The original 8mm film is in the Air Force Museum now. These were sound movies, or these were silent movies. I added the sound to it later on when I put it on a videotape. You'll be able to see the weaponry hanging off the plane here in a second. He's venting fuel there because he couldn't land. There was too much fuel on the plane to land. There's the sun's up better now. You can see the bombs on it. That whooshing sound is the oxygen mask working. Okay, now this is back on the revetment area. This is a pre-takeoff check of the plane. I kind of put this together to show what a mission was like. So we went out and we checked the aircraft over. Climb up the ladder into the back. Walk along the edge of the wing to get in. Right along there. That's the back seat. This is taxiing out of the revetments. As you might imagine, Thailand in the summer is quite warm. and very, very humid. This is 1973. This is the last part of the war. No, that's why we had to go back and he had to jettison the bombs. There was a jettison area off the end of the runway where they could jettison them. The bombs, while they were on there and they could be released to be jettisoned, they also had a little propeller on each one of the nose tips that had to go around to arm them. So they were hot because the pins had been pulled, but they wouldn't explode till that little propeller went around to arm the bomb. Okay, this is a takeoff roll. As I said, we took off at about 180 knots. That's about 180 miles an hour. I guess you could just think of that terms. There's the afterburners. That's a good question. I really can't answer that one. It was a civilian military joint base in northern Thailand. One side of the runway was used by Thai Air, the other side was used by the military. So it had to hold, it had to be long enough for jet aircraft of both types to take off and land. This is flying over northern Thailand. You can see how swampy and wet it is all the time. We had to take malaria pills once a week, quinine every Monday night. And you'll see rain in the distance. The afternoon monsoons would roll in about 4 o'clock every day. This is some of the monsoon clouds here. This next whole sequence is air refueling. It was one of the skills that a lot of the pilots had never done when they went into training to learn how to fly the F-4. There we are, 19,000 feet. There's the radar. The front seater probably was flying it because I was running the radar to do the intercept. We basically had to locate the tanker. That was my job, to find it on the radar and direct the pilot how to get there. Okay, this is all air refueling. It looks so easy, but it's very difficult. And there's a lot of turbulence coming off the tanker. So they had to be very good at what they were doing. You can see color markings on the boom that they would line up. On the bottom of the tanker there were lights that they would get into a certain position with their canopy to know where to line up right. I think the most I ever saw was 8 F-4s waiting to take on gas. And the boom went into a receptacle right back here, right behind my head. So there were occasions where you got a little nervous about the way things were happening. And I'd heard stories about a boom going through the back canopy rather than into the receptacle. You can see the ordnance on these bombs hanging off these airplanes. Now, the boomer, which is the SAC guy, literally flies the boom. He has a joystick that he can control the boom, and he and the pilot maneuver to get it into position. It looks so easy there. The other thing to keep in mind is the average refueling track was a race track. So you go down, turn, and then go back up another leg, turn, and come down. So you could be refueling as you went into one of those turns, going around the top of the racetrack and coming out the other end. I only heard of one pilot who got sent home because he couldn't refuel. He probably shouldn't have been over there to start with if he wasn't qualified to refuel. We would refuel on an average combat mission maybe 3 or 4 times They could, yeah. In fact, there were stories of a boom snapping off and being in the receptacle and staying there when they landed. Yeah. But usually, if things really got bad, the boomer disconnected and the tanker got up and out of the way. The tanker was basically a 200,000 gallon gasoline bomb. Yeah. This is in northern Cambodia. There's a big lake over there called Tonle Sap Lake. It's in the area near Angkor Wat. They were always pointing Angkor Wat out to me as we were getting down to that area, but I never did see it. It's kind of hard to pick it out in the jungle at 35,000 feet. So this is the Mekong River now. We're going down to Phnom Penh, Thailand, or Cambodia. This is the time when the Khmer Rouge were trying to take over Cambodia, and we were at the end of the war, and the war was to end on August 15th, 1973. So they were flying missions 24 hours a day to try to keep the Khmer Rouge from taking over in Cambodia. Unfortunately, they took over in Cambodia and killed a lot of people. It's very sad. You'll notice here round circles on the ground that look like craters of the moon. They're actually bomb craters filled with water. That's the Mekong. I saw the Mekong quite a lot from the air, which I guess is better than seeing the Mekong from the ground, you Army guys. This is the city of Phnom Penh, Cambodia. I keep wanting to say Thailand. That's the Phnom Penh airport. The communist Khmer Rouge were off the end of the runway with shoulder-held surface-to-air missiles trying to shoot down the 130 Air Force cargo planes landing on the runway. This is a forward air controller coming in. He would tell us where to put the bombs. In a second, you'll see a bomb going off. There's the bomb going off. And again, we flew in a racetrack. We'd be on one side of the racetrack. He'd be dropping a bomb. He'd come around. We'd go around, drop our bombs. And then afterward, there's another bomb going off. I'm taking these from the other side of the racetrack, obviously. This is on the way back. He was attempting to break the tension of the moment. The F-4 only flies for about 30 seconds upside down before the engine seizes. It's going back into Udorn, again with all of the water around there. We're getting ready to land. Okay, we're getting ready to land. There's the gear coming down. When I taught at the Air Force Academy, the last class of every semester I showed my movies. I figured they needed to understand that they were going to be warriors someday. Not engineers, all of them. Just off the end of the runway. They have these large irrigation canals around the base. You'll see a couple of them right there called klongs, which drained off the area around the buildings so that they weren't flooded. The C-130s that brought in supplies and mail, they were called the Klong Airline. There he comes in for a landing. The F-4 J-79 engines put out a real heavy smoke trail at first. Later on, they were modified so that they didn't do that. But the running joke was that the gunners on the ground, all they had to do was sight the smoke trail and just follow it right up to the engines. There's a drag chute slowing down the planes. I used to tell the cadets that must have been a Navy pilot the way he hit the ground. Okay, you can see him coming in. Normally they would jettison the drogue chute. It would go sailing off to an area where they picked him up later on. This is the pitch out. If you've ever been to an air show, you can see a fighter doing one of these turns. That's called a pitch out. There's looking down at all the revetments. That was our squadron pickup truck that picked us up, took us in. This is a little bit later in the day. This is the 130 mail plane coming in. A couple shots of F-4s taking off. Now I'll show you our squadron mascot. That was the best thing all day, was when the mail plane came in, and you don't know how important mail is. Here you can see the afterburner really cooking right there. And of course the war went on 24 hours a day when I was there, because they were trying to put an end to the Khmer Rouge taking over Cambodia. You can just see him climbing out over the center there in a second, right up in the middle. This is just a little bit later that it had gotten quite dark for the camera, but you can see the afterburner pretty well there. When the afterburners were engaged, the F-4 used 1,000 pounds of fuel a minute. With the tanks on, it weighed about 38,000 pounds empty, so maybe 16,000 pounds of fuel. Okay, this is our squadron. We were the Panther Pack, 13th Tactical Fighter Squadron, and that was our mascot, Eldridge. Now, what else would you name a Black Panther in the 60s but Eldridge, right? I mean, Eldridge was a gift to us from the CIA. He was picked up I want to say he was picked up in Laos. And by the time I took these pictures, he was about ready to go to the Phoenix Zoo. He was so big we couldn't keep him any longer. But he was just like a big old house cat. If you don't mind a big old house cat that weighs over 100 pounds and has big long claws. He was quite a boy. Everybody that came to Udorn, the base, came to see Eldridge. Anybody that went through the base came by. There was a superstition in the squadron that you had to give Eldridge a salute before you took off, went on a combat mission.
Do you have any females on your base?
Female enlisted people, or there were not that many female officers, intel officers maybe, yeah. Yeah, there were a lot of female enlisted people. Oh yeah, that wasn't all male. Fighter squadrons were all men at that time. There were no female fighter pilots. There's Eldridge taking a break. That was my pilot that was playing with him there. You can see, I've got on a silver bracelet, you can see his is solid gold, only his was 3 strands of gold. We all kind of wore these because we felt maybe if we got shot down, we'd have something to trade. You can see him jumping out of the way. That guy's name was Major Blood. Now, is that a great name for a fighter pilot? Sounds like a pirate, doesn't it? An air pirate. Okay, Eldridge went every place he wanted to go. There he's on the wing commander's car. Yeah. Oh, I'll have to give you a quiz, Josephine. You've been reading my book. Oh, now he sees the Triple Nickel was the premier air squadron. He sees their dog Nickel.
Oh boy.
How about a snack? You can see Nickel was not too thrilled to have Eldridge going after him. He's quite a cat. He just got so big we couldn't keep him. He went to the Phoenix Zoo in December of '73. He stayed there. He was there for 23 years. He died in '96. He had 6 offspring he fathered. This was our wing building. Those were MiG kills. during the course of the war, MiG aircraft that were shot down. When I was in Alaska, I flew with Chuck de Bellevue, who was the leading ace of the war. Chuck was a backseater when he became the leading ace, but you couldn't have a navigator who was the leading ace of the Vietnam War, so he was a pilot by the time I flew with him. They got him through pilot training. This is where I lived. These were called the hooches. It was not really plush living. It was serviceable. It was okay. That was our maid. She basically every day spit shined my boots, did my laundry, made the bed, cleaned the room. Her name was Dang. There were two of us in the room. I think she had at least two rooms. Each of the guys paid her 30 bucks. She made good money for a tie. That was a good wage. But you can see how they washed the clothes like your great-grandmother might have done in a wash tub. And then they would hang them over the railings to dry. Unfortunately, every night they sprayed the area with insecticides to kill the mosquitoes, and it was the same trucks and tanks that they'd sprayed Agent Orange. So they didn't clean the tanks. So a lot of us got exposed to Agent Orange indirectly. This is a monsoon. The captains lived and lieutenants lived in these hooches. The majors and lieutenant colonels lived in the trailers that were just in sight. If it looks a little fuzzy, it's because when I came out, my camera lens fogged over. Okay, these are outside the gate. This typical Thai family, they're bathing in this pool, which is right next to the area where they sprayed the herbicide. So I was wondering how many cases of Agent Orange there were in the Thai population. That's at 1:30. All right, I think that's about it. David, you're on. Tell them how to build an F-4 now. David and I discovered each other on Facebook.
So I became interested in airplanes in the 80s, always an aviation enthusiast, not a pilot, never in the military, and I always loved the look of the F-4. And before the internet, I was making a little mock-up. You could buy little parts here and there. I had a joystick and an instrument panel, and then I bought an ejection seat, and I was going to make like a little mock-up in my basement. And then once the internet came out in around 89 or 90, I found that you could actually buy cockpits from scrapyards around the country. So it took me about 2 years to search, and I found one. This is what it looked like here, right outside of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, which is known as the Boneyard. This was a private scrapyard, so it was no longer owned by the government. And this plane here had about 32 panels missing. The panels are these little holes where they would take a panel off to get it instruments and equipment behind there. And anyone else in the country that had an F-4 for a static display or for a museum that needed a piece, they take it off this bird. This is their parts bird. So after 2 years of searching, I found a lot of other airplanes, a lot of helicopters, but I wanted an F-4. So I was stuck with the parts bird. So this was, again, in Arizona. That's what the backside looked like. So I had to have them cut and clean that all up. And then I had it transported to Rochester on a special trailer. This gentleman here that transport these airplanes, he does this for a living, transports planes all around the VFW posts and museums and whatnot. So after I got it to Rochester, I had to store it next to my house for about a year while I looked for shop space to work on it. So neighbors would walk by and say, "What is that? Is that, you got a boat back there or what?" Now I usually always had a tarp on it or a couple of tarps to cover it. So when I got the plane, it did have some instruments in it, and it had a lot of sand in it, as you can see in the instruments on the side and stuff. And when I did finally find some affordable shop space, I had it towed out there. And one of the first things we did was open it up and try to strip out as much stuff as we could to reduce the weight for towing it around. My idea was to take this to air shows as a photo booth where people could sit in it. I'd take their picture for a fee. So one of the first things that we did was I worked with a friend of mine in Virginia that also had an F4, and he came up, and this is called capping off the back end. The cockpit was cut at what's known as the production brake. These two areas here is where the engine inlets would be, and then we put some bracing on the back and did basically a lot of sheet metal work. These are called clecos, which are fasteners that will hold the sheet metal in place until you rivet it in. And we capped off the whole back end. That was the first major project we did. Then we had to strip all the paint off, and so we took it outside and power washed it a little bit, got a little clean. Then the fuselage had holes punched in it, which is part of what the government calls the demilling process, so that no one would fly it again. Now, if it didn't have a tail or wing, you wouldn't be able to fly it anyway, but that's the government for you. So basically, you treat these holes the same as you would auto body. You know, you put a backing plate on, and then you do some fiberglass work and some Bondo, and sand it. This here shows the whole vertical ramp of this aircraft was missing. So I was lucky enough to find a local young man that did sheet metal work, and he did a fantastic job fabricating not only all the panels, but the railings, the ladder, as well as the vertical ramp. And there's a shot of the cockpit. The next thing is I did all the work on the inside. I did all the work on putting the instruments in, cleaning them up, putting the ejection seats, which were obviously safe inside the plane. There's the back seat. John, does that look familiar?
I think so.
And this is a great opportunity for my son and I to work on the plane. You know, great bonding experience. We go out there on the weekends and take parts off and work on it. Here he is drilling out some rivets. And the next thing was to install the ejection seats, which were pretty heavy and pretty old and mangled. So we got those mounted in after a while. And then because there were so many panels missing on the bottom of the plane and the nose gear was still in the airplane, we had to raise it up. So the guy that did the metal work for me, his father moved houses, so they had all this cribbing. So they came out and they put it up on this cribbing so that we could raise the F4 up in the air and drop the nose gear and remove that. And then he tackled working on the panels on the underside. Now, it took me about 8 years on and off to fully restore it. The shop I had was not heated, so I typically did not do much work on it in the winter. And then for a whole year, my metalwork guy went to Japan to learn how to do metalwork over there. So 8 years on and off as time and money would allow. I had to have a custom trailer fabricated to hold the weight of the plane and to have the mounts so the heavy plane would stay on the trailer without falling off, obviously. So then we had it painted and starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel as the bank account got lower and lower. And then I worked with a local graphics company to have the vinyl decals put on the plane. And there's the finished product there. So I wanted mine to look like it looked in Vietnam. Now, my airplane is a F4D model, and it actually flew in the same squadron that John was in, although my plane had been sent stateside when John had arrived. So mine was over in Udorn from 70 to 72 in the 432nd Tactical Fighter, or 432nd Tactical Recon Wing. So here's a picture of my son and I at one of our air shows. So we take it around pretty much in the New England area. We haven't done anything the last 2 years with COVID. And last year was pretty much a bust because any air shows that were a drive-in variety where you had to sit in your car, and they didn't allow vendors to do this. So there's a picture of us down at the Geneseo Air Show. And the Thunderbirds flying over. And, you know, this is the state troopers' newest tool in catching speeders. No, we were at Niagara Falls Air Force Base, and the state troopers had a booth right next door, and they wanted to come by and get their picture in the F4 to try to, as a recruitment tool. And a lot of air shows, you know, again, prior to COVID, you'd have 100,000 people. And as it would become later and later in the day and more people would enter the gates, they would crowd right around your airplane. and all the other airplanes there. Most of the other airplanes on static were all flyable. Mine was the only one that was a static display. Here's somebody you might recognize. John and Bonnie and his friend Brent have come out to many air shows with me, and John's very helpful in talking about the F4 to people that...
Anything I don't know, I make up.
And John's brought his family over. We become great friends. John found out about my F4, and I live in Honeoye Falls, which is maybe 30 minutes away. And he comes over a couple times a year, and I pull the airplane out and brings friends over, or his family, or grandkids. And Bonnie, of course, is the driver, so she gets in the front seat. And there's John. Now these gloves, John, these were original from Vietnam, correct?
I still have one pair left.
Still flight gloves. Great to see them.
Your government, every year you get a new pair of flight gloves, whether you need them or not. So when I got out of the Air Force, I had about 6 pairs I'd never even worn, because you don't wear brand new ones all the time. You like them broken in.
And I've taken some nice pictures of John. It's a pleasure to get to know him and have him come along and stuff. It's a pleasure to help contribute to his book, and there we are. So, and that's that.
Well, you got any questions?
Anybody have any questions on flying the F4? Or I think one of the biggest questions I get on the air show is, how long do I make my money back? And maybe another 75, 100 years, I'll... Now, it's really a labor of love. I love meeting the veterans out there, the pilots, the crew, the crew chiefs that used to work on the F4. Yes? I did do the Geneseo Air Show in 2014. That was the first year that I did it.
Are you going to do it anymore?
So we'll have to see what they do. Last year they did a drive-in only show. And a lot of people also don't realize that in order for me to go to an air show as a vendor, I have to pay them a fee. And if it rains one day, and the fee is so much, it could be a bust. Yeah. And that's why I don't take the airplane to California or to Texas, because the expenses would just be out enormous, The canopies do not work. I do have a friend that's in St. Louis that also restored an F4, and he uses scuba tanks to raise and lower his canopies. But they take 2,000 pounds of pressure to open and close. So I do everything manually, and I get my son back here to lift them up. And
What did the initial nose piece cost you?
So it was pretty cheap. The plane itself was only $10,000. So then there's another $5,000 to have it transported to New York from the shipper, $2,000 for a crane, and then I probably got 60 or 80 into it.
Did you have to bid it? Did you have to bid on it, or was it?
No, whoever was dumb enough to come up with the money could buy it. A lot of people ask me, what does your wife think? And then I joke and say, well, I was divorced. But that was before I got the plane. So.
It was a lot.
No, I just fly this flight simulator, armchair pilot. John's the real hero.
I don't know about that. It is a lot cheaper to fly a real one than it is to buy one and build one, though.
Yeah.
Cheap to fly, you have to learn to fly.
Yes.
Your cockpit, they have all the gauges and the controls?
It is 100% accurate. Some of the hardest gauges to get would be the nuclear consent switch, which I won't say where I got it, but a lot of the instruments too that I didn't have, I would either buy on eBay or trade with other collectors. Now eBay, because Iran still flies the F4, there's export rules. You cannot sell certain aviation or military parts overseas, so you got to be careful in that respect.
You may not realize it, but the F4 was nuclear carrying qualified, and when we were in Alaska, we had a nuclear mission. And they have around the nuke planes what they call a no-loan zone, which means you always have to have 2 people in that area together.
Good.
Were the F4s flown to Vietnam, or were they transported and put together?
No, they were flown over. Oh, yeah.
Now, did you fly yours over?
Mine was already there. Somebody brought it over. I don't know when this particular model. This is my F4. My name's on the cockpit. I don't know when the 262 was brought over, but they were flown over. And generally what they would do is ferry them over and just hang on the tanks, refuel, fly to an extra refueling point, refuel, and they might be in the air. And then they would go from California to Guam maybe, or they would go from California to Alaska, to Japan, and then to the Philippines, and down to Vietnam, but they were all flown over different routes.
Did you keep the same aircraft through your whole tour?
No, we flew different ones. I was crewed, the way they work it is when you're a new guy, you're crewed with an old head. So I was crewed with a couple old pilots who had been there 6-8 months, who knew the ins and outs of everything. And that went on for about 4 or 5 months until they considered I was an old head. And then new pilots, new green lieutenants would come over, and you'd get scared.
Were you ever in Da Nang?
No, I never flew out of South Vietnam. All the F-4s when I was there were flying out of Thailand. And as I said, we were only flying in Cambodia at that point. This was the point in 1973 after the so-called peace accords had been signed, where nothing was supposed to be happening. However, in our intel briefs, we were always being told about all the stuff coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So really, the peace is in the eye of the beholder, folks. That's the way it always is. Any other questions?
Were your missions mostly bombing, or did you support ground?
That's a good question. Our squadron was what we were called an air-to-mud squadron, so we bombed all the time. The triple nickel, the 555th, which was the air-to-air squadron, only did air-to-air missions. In other words, these are guys that got all the MiG kills. They did. We didn't. Although we had all the missiles in case we encountered a MiG. In Cambodia, that was very unlikely. Had we been flying over Laos or up into North Vietnam again, we would have been more in a position to encounter MiGs. I have to tell you this, and I put this in the book. I honestly wish I had flown north. It's hard to explain, but it's true. When you're a warrior, you want to be in the big leagues. Any other questions today?
John, would you comment on Major Shorak, please?
Ted Shorak, he was my ROTC instructor at Hobart. Ted is well known in the Geneva community. There's actually a stained glass window in the Baptist church over there with his name on it. There's a hangar with his name on it down at the Keuka airport. He was one of the primary instructors when I was in ROTC, taught flying to everybody. First airplane flight I had military was with Ted Shorak. 3 days before I was to graduate, he went over to South Vietnam, and in the fall of '65, he was killed on a rescue mission. And so the book's dedicated to Ted. He was quite a guy, very motivational.
Dave, did you tell them that the house you bought because it had a hangar?
Right. So after I restored the plane and I was tired of paying a second mortgage for shop space, we started looking for a house that had either land where I could build a pole barn or already had an existing pole barn. Currently, I was living in a town of Greece in a small suburban house, and so we luckily happened to come across a house right in Honeoye Falls. It was adjacent to the old Honeoye Falls Airport. It actually had an airplane hangar. So I now store the plane in there along with my camper and a bunch of other junk.
Yeah, he had us over December 2019. We'd been over a lot of times, and he had a simulator set up. So Eileen Cooley, my wife, and Brent and I, we all got to fly this F4 simulator. How many times did they crash?
But at least they didn't eject.
That's true. That's another thing about flying a fighter. You never leave a perfectly good airplane. No, most people would much rather dead stick it into the ground than to eject out of a jet. I'm surprised nobody asked me about breaking the sound barrier when I was talking about Mach 2. Anybody see the movie The Right Stuff?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What did you think about how Hollywood portrayed Yeager going through the sound barrier? Hollywood. Yeah, when you go through Mach 1, you don't see swirling vortexes and other weird things. I would assume he was probably buffeted around a lot in that little X1, but generally speaking, it's just like regular flying. Suddenly you're flying faster than the speed of sound. Same thing with going Mach 2. You just
Faster than the speed of sound, are you aware of the sound boom, or is it?
no, you're not, because you are ahead of the sound in the air mass.
Yes.
You don't hear the boom. The boom is behind you somewhere. And same thing with going Mach 2, you don't hear it. The only thing that can tell you that you're going fast is you look at the Mach meter, which tells you that you're going Mach 1 or Mach 2. And you can also see the speed and things obviously moving by quickly.
What does Mach stand for exactly?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
You're going the speed of Mach 1 or the speed of Mach 2. What does
Yeah,
that mean?
I really don't. Well, Mach is 750 miles an hour. That's the speed of sound.
Right. So
So,
Mach 1 would be up to that, and then Mach 2.
right, Mach 2 is about 1,500 miles an hour. The SR-71, which was a spy plane, could go over Mach 3. That's classified, but they don't fly anymore because of satellites. Any other questions?
John, when you got your teeth back from the house girls doing your laundry, did they have a lot of starch in it?
That's a good question. I don't remember. I do remember. I don't think so. I don't think they starched them.
Ours used to stand right up by themselves.
He was at Utapao, which was a SAC base in southern Thailand. If you know Thailand, it kind of comes down with a peninsula. Utapao's down in that lower.
Gulf of Siam.
Yeah, right. We were way up in the north. Udorn is right about 30 miles from Vientiane, Laos, right at the top of Thailand. So it was very easy to overfly Laos, even though we weren't supposed to if something slightly went wrong. It wasn't the navigator's fault, I guarantee you. Pilots. Any other questions? Well, if anybody's interested in a book, we have some here. They're 20 bucks a piece, and we're going to donate some of the money to the choir tour, and David and I will be happy to inscribe our life story, or at least our names. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Lots of F4s over there. Make sure you get one.
Ken loves this.